Hello and welcome to Express Sports Podcast. You're listening to Game Time with me, Mihir Vasavda. Amit Kamath is there as always, and also joining us is Vinayakk Mohanarangan all the way from Chennai. He's our man in Delhi, but on a break, kind enough to take some time out. And we do need him this week because we'll be talking about a topic that's, I think it's left many of us shattered, not least the hockey lovers who had been expecting quite a few things from the women's team since the time they had peaked at Tokyo, but unfortunately, as the Paris Olympics just 6 months away from the opening ceremony, the women's hockey team will not be there. So today, in this episode, we'll be trying to make sense of why a team that finished 4th at the Tokyo Olympics won't even be going to Paris. Before we get into the why and how, Vinayakk, welcome first of all. Why don't you take us through that horrid week, so to say, in Ranchi during the qualifiers? A quick recap of what happened.
Yeah, I think the end result was horrid for sure. It was quite a roller coaster. I had high hopes for the team, especially after the way they played the Asian Champions Trophy in Ranchi, for which we were there from the Indian Express. The idea of having the Olympic qualifiers at home, I think, was one of the first big steps that, made us think that, okay, so these guys have a good chance of going, because these were originally supposed to be held in China. And after China won the women's hockey gold at Asian Games at the cost of India in the semifinals, the Hockey India moved quickly to shift the qualifiers out of China to India. It made more sense because, China not being in the fray for qualification anymore, having won their ticket through Asian Games, it made sense for a team that is hosting and being a part of the qualifiers. It made sense all around. So that was the first sort of thing that made us feel like, okay, so these guys have a good chance to make it. And just based on their quality of play in recent times, sure, there have not been like major titles, but in general, their overall play has been good enough. They're 6th in the world. So, that it felt like, this was a golden chance despite missing out on the ticket in Hangzhou to get through to the Paris Olympics. They had the quality to do that. I know, Mihir, you've written about how this was on the cards for a while, but even considering the signs that were there, like I was probably more worried about what would happen when they went to Paris, but not about them going to Paris. I was kind of confident that they had it in them to make it through. But I think the problem started from the first day when they couldn't beat the USA in the group stage match. I think looking back, that was a big blow because that meant they couldn't top the group and they had to face Germany in the semifinals. They did recover well enough with a huge win against New Zealand. That again gave some hope after the despair of the USA defeat. It was a good win against New Zealand. They played really well, near flawless, I would say. And then they did their job against Italy, a team that they would have expected to beat, but the top spot was already away from them, which meant they had to face the top-ranked Germany in semifinals. And they probably came up with their best performance of the tournament in that Germany match, given the quality that Germany possessed and given India's record against Germany in recent past. You had written about how the lopsided the head-to-head has been between them. To do that, to go all the way to equalize with minutes left and take it to a penalty shootout where they led by 2 clear goals and then to lose that, I think that was a big heartbreak, right? They punched well above their weight that day and, they should have probably crossed the finish line. And then it came down to one last chance against Japan, and that sort of a lottery is never a good place to be in, where, that is it, it's do or die. And Jude Meneses, a former Indian Olympian, who knows a thing or two about Olympic heartbreaks for India, he handed the final heartbreak to Janneke Schopman's team. And yeah, that Japan defeat was, Jude Meneses said before the match that, the first goal was going to be key. And just like that, they scored the first goal. And after that, they just sat back and defended for, I think, 55 minutes or so, which, India couldn't just break the house down that night. Again, it kind of reminiscent of the USA defeat. It started and ended that way. So that's the recap. And yeah, no more opportunities. They've had enough chances. I think 3 direct chances to qualify for the Olympics, and all 3 have been wasted. So, yeah.
Yeah, and I'll come to it later, why I said that this was on the cards. I think, there are 2 ways to look at it, of course. You are right when you say that they were world number 6 and all. But yeah, we'll come, of course, to those points. Now, 3 chances, of course. The first one they missed was at the Asian Games in Hangzhou, where they lost to China, thus ending their hopes. China qualifying directly, as Vinayakk mentioned. And the 2 matches, Germany and then Japan. In fact, it's crazy because 2015, when India broke that 30-odd-year-old drought of not being at the Olympics when they qualified for the Rio Games, the match that won that qualification was against Japan, and it was exactly opposite to what happened last weekend. It was Savita in the goal. It was the golden generation of players. India had taken lead with an early goal. And for the rest of the match, I think it was 50 minutes or 40 odd minutes, I don't remember exactly. But it was like India was at defense throughout. And it's crazy how roles reversed. And here we were at Ranchi, Japan scoring an early goal, and for 54 minutes, they were doing that. So in a way, they returned the favor to India, not the kind of result, of course, any of us here in India wanted to see. But Amit, 3 years ago, यार हम थे वहां पर in Tokyo, and we saw tears. There were tears in Ranchi, but that day the tears were kind of different because it was the most unexpected high Indian women's hockey would have expected at that point. What do you recall, and how do you see this fall?
Yeah, absolutely, Mihir. I think when you say it was the most unexpected finish, let me just set the scene for what had happened even before these guys made it to Tokyo. Because it was, I believe, only the third Olympics that an Indian women's hockey team was playing. At the previous Olympics, which they had qualified for, Rio, I believe they finished 12th out of all 12 teams that had gone. Then they started the tournament at Tokyo. They had the first 3 games they lost. So for them, I mean, the odds were against them even to make it to the quarterfinals, let alone the semifinals. But somehow they ran into Australia in the quarters, and everybody was like, done. No way they are beating, I think, multiple-time Olympic champions Australia, who were back then, I think, world number 2. So all throughout, there were hurdles along the way. I don't think anybody, maybe not even people in the hockey fraternity, had thought that they would be, in touching distance of a medal. And despite everything, somehow we kept seeing them, put one foot right. Then suddenly they were qualifying for out of the group. Then they were taking on Australia, and Gurjeet scores a penalty corner. Then she pushes India into the semis against Argentina. So we've seen this tumble. And I think one of the most remarkable memories I had of that whole tournament, I'm not going to name anybody, but I think a couple of sports journalists also were tearing up in the stands. Long time hockey correspondents.
Yeah. Thanks, Amit. Thanks.
I mean, I wasn't going to name anybody, but you've just outed yourself, Mihir.
I mean, it was just as a proper nudge, wink, wala thing, but theek hai.
But yeah, so I mean, not just that. One of the other moments that I noticed was, I think they used to have these golf buggies to transport the players to the press conference room. And in the golf buggy, like the captain of the team, Rani Rampal, and the coach, Shod Marin, both of them were sitting there waiting to be transported to the press conference room. And they had a very nice moment. It was almost one of those moments that a father and a kid would share after getting to a goal that they had maybe seen together since they were childhood. All those early morning training sessions that they would go through, all those hardships that they had to overcome. They had that sort of a moment, I don't think a lot was said between them, but they shared that moment where they were basically overcome by the enormity of what they had just done. Yeah, and they came very close to, making it to winning the semi-final, making it to the final, or even winning a bronze medal. Eventually, it was not to be. But back then, everybody thought that, that 4th place finish was a stepping stone 3 years later for them to do something better at Paris. Well, as we know now, that it was kind of a false start in a sense.
Yeah, and those 2 characters, right? You mentioned Shod Marin and Rani Rampal. Both, they aren't there anymore in the picture. Shod, of course, immediately moved on. He had announced in Tokyo itself that he'll be moving on. And a succession plan was in place anyway, which meant that his assistant in Tokyo, Yannicka Schopman, took over the team. And as we saw in the months that followed after the Tokyo Olympics, her style imprinted on the team. Vinayakk and I, of course, will be perhaps differing on the view here. Rani Rampal was, of course, out, and, well, it can be debated 2 years later, ki Rani difference lati, nahi lati. I don't think that's the question anymore. I'm sure, Vinayakk, you agree there. But just, you've seen the team coached by Yannicka Schopman in action. What do you think of the team, of the preparations? We'll get into each point step by step, of course. But Vinayakk, Yannicka as a coach, there are questions about her future now. And as is the case every time there is a big setback in Indian hockey, the first scapegoat to be made is the coach always. Do you think it will be fair to kind of pin the blame on her for this result?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that we are recording now, and who knows by the time it's out what the status is. That's how Indian hockey works. Yeah, so as of now, we haven't heard anything yet officially. Yeah, you're right, Mihir. So I think I would just go back to what Amit said about Tokyo being a false start. I actually have a completely different view on that. I think Tokyo, in a way, this team has probably paid the price for the success in Tokyo, right? The reason I say that is they were clearly underdogs. I mean, Amit set it up beautifully. I mean, no one expected them to go that far. And it was just like sheer, rear guard against Australia. I remember live blogging that match. I mean, it was just holding on to dear lives on defense. And even you mentioned 2015, how they got to Rio. That was the kind of style that, not even style, that was the kind of the team India were at that time. Score probably 1 or 2 and then defend with all you got. And that Australia match, probably any other day, maybe 8 out of 10 times Australia would have found a way to equalize and gone through. And, it was complete rear guard. And on that note, the reason that I don't see Vinayakk Mohanarangan's tenure as a bad one is because she completely transformed what India are as a team since Tokyo. Right? I mean, we've not just sit back and hope that, Rani Rampal get the winner, Navneet hits the winner. That's kind of what Rani Rampal specialized in, sort of get that big moment and make the most of it sort of player that she was. And she was great at that. The way Vinayakk Mohanarangan saw it, she knew that she could transform this team into much more with the talent that she had. She backed the youngsters. I still don't know whether she did the right thing by keeping Rani Rampal aside or not. I've been conflicted about that forever because I think if probably they could have gotten on the same page, Rani still had something to offer in a team that probably wasn't in the style that, Vinayakk wanted, but still could have used a finisher. This is not something that Vinayakk has ever said in a press conference in a public forum, that Rani wasn't fast enough to play in my setup. But that is the kind of takeaway that I've had with, the Dutch style that Vinayakk wanted this team to play. Speed on the flank, speed through the middle, just fast transitions, pass and move. All this, she probably felt Rani wasn't in the scheme of things. And I think if they could have maybe found a way in the middle ground to, probably find a solution out of it, it might have worked out. But the reason I don't see Vinayakk's time as a failure is because we saw this at the World Cup. We saw this, I think, at the Nations Cup. We saw this at the Commonwealth Games. I remember the semi-finals against Australia was at the Commonwealth Games was a complete contrast to the quarterfinal in Tokyo, right? These guys, they trailed for most of the match and they had it at Australia throughout almost, right? I mean, they created chances. They didn't sit back. They used their pace. They still didn't have the finisher that you've already mentioned in your article where, they were not able to convert those chances, but it was completely different to what we used to see from the team before Vinayakk had come in. She had a vision. I don't know if she was 100% successful in implementing that vision, but the one thing that is for certain from what we have seen on the pitch is teams started respecting India's attack more and started to sit back. We saw that at the World Cup. We saw that at the Nation Cup. Teams started defending against India and, sort of letting India attack and then trying to hope to hit them on the counter and, make the most of the chances. So that was, I think, the biggest thing that Vinayakk changed. The identity of the team, that she wanted them to play a certain brand of hockey. I think she succeeded in doing that without the necessary end result. So in a way, I don't know if this is hoping against hope or whatever, that they see what the identity change has been and probably hope that, given 2 more years, she can probably find the solutions in terms of goal scoring as well. But you never know. I mean, you know better than me on how this whole business goes in Indian hockey.
No, I think these are all great points. And I agree with you about Tokyo, I mean, if I was to draw a parallel, just bring in my Guju and give a share market parallel. Like if we were to see Tokyo, then it was like an unprecedented market high and there had to be a correction at some point. It just so happens, unfortunately, the correction comes at a very wrong time for the women's team. But at the same time, while I agree with you, about all these points that you're making about the playing style, and I mean, I completely agree over Rani Rampal thing as well, because every coach has a right to kind of pick players that will suit her style. And if she had to kind of punt on a young player, then at least she went ahead and did it with full conviction. It wasn't a half-hearted attempt. So full marks over there, which is great. And there was clarity in what she wanted from her team. The problem I actually had, Vinayakk, was there was no clear communication. And I'm not talking only about Rani. I mean, there was this constant thing over, the fact that on the eve of the tournament, if about your key defender, Deep Grace Ekka, she's not in the squad and the only thing coach has to offer is that, you should ask the player, then that's like, pointing at something a lot more fishy behind the scenes. To me, it might not be. We might be overreacting, reading too much between the lines, but still it points towards that direction.
100%. 100%. I think even with the Rani issue, there was not clear in communication, right? I mean, we've wondered.
Exactly. Yeah. And again, like, we don't know how much of it was the coach's call and how much of it was Hockey India, because Hockey India is again such a body that doesn't really believe in communicating clearly.
And no selection is explained, right? I mean, we see squads through press releases and there are like omissions and additions that we typically don't know why, right? I mean, it's been the case with the men's and the women's team for a while now.
Yeah. So that was a bigger problem there. And then we can go on into the nitty-gritties. But when you also mention, about the performances, what I end up looking for is, I mean, if you look at, and which is what I mentioned in one of the pieces that we wrote as well, that India's two big achievements this century, since 2002 Commonwealth Games and the Tokyo Olympics. And the common thing both those occasions was that they beat higher ranked opponents, teams that were better than them. And they haven't just done that in this cycle from Tokyo to Paris. And that will only get you until a certain point. Japan were always targeting the qualifiers, and the Asian Champions Trophy, you were there, you would perhaps know better. But from what I understand now, they came and just kind of got a look and feel of the place, a dress rehearsal, and then they performed in the main thing. So the planning bit is what gets me. You had a golden opportunity to seal the spot at the Asian Games, and that was missed. Then you have 3 months to prepare for the qualifiers, which should have been the sole focus. I think everyone got a bit carried away with the Asian Champions Trophy, as often it happens. It's happened so many times with the men's team in the past, where they'll perform well in one tournament where other teams are not going all out. And then when the main thing comes, you just like kind of crash. It happened with the men's team. I remember, I think at the Rio Olympics, where just a month before it at the Champions Trophy, India were like playing like a dream. They played the best match ever in this decade against Australia. And then when the games came, they just crashed out. So they're falling into the same trap which we've seen the men's team fall into again and again. And that's like a worry for me. Amit, you've been like very silent throughout this whole thing. Where do you stand on the coach issue, on the results, and what's your take on this whole performance thing?
Mihir, I think I understand that, Vinayakk Mohanarangan wanted to mold the team into her Dutch style, as Vinayak pointed out, have a fast-paced attack. And I think she's done, a lot of the training sessions that go into making this team the lean, mean machine that they are. We see all of that. But the problem with that is, discarding a player like Rani when even Short Marine, when he was using Rani, she wasn't in the team to play the whole match. She was more like an impact sub of sorts. So maybe Vinayakk Mohanarangan could have maybe, had some sort of an agreement of sorts where she tells Rani that, you are supposed to do this and you only get to play these many minutes. And obviously you don't need to have her play at that pace that the rest of the team. I mean, all of this is in hindsight, because now that the team is not going to play at Paris, we are going to go back to the drawing board again, going to figure out what happens next. So yeah, obviously hindsight is 2020, but I do get that Vinayakk Mohanarangan had a very set system, and obviously Rani didn't fit into it. But the problem was when you didn't have a player like Gurjeet in the team, when you didn't have a player like Vandana Kataria in the team, who else was stepping up? We saw Salima Tete doing a lot of stick work. She was absolutely brilliant on the flanks and with the pace. But when it comes to scoring goals, where was that coming from? Obviously, I mean, somebody like a Vinayakk will have a much better angle on whether Vinayakk could have still accommodated Rani, maybe adjusted or made a slight adjustment. But Mihir, you spoke about, that Asian Champions Trophy title being like a false dawn. Just for the sake of our listeners, I also wanted to point out India's results at big tournaments after Tokyo. They've reached the semis of the 2022 Asian Cup. They didn't make it to the quarters of the World Cup, reached the semis of the Commonwealth Games and the semis of the Asian Games. So maybe, I mean, their inability to qualify for Paris Olympics is not that much of a surprise. It, as you mentioned, Mihir, in a piece, that it had been coming. The writing was on the wall for a while now.
Yeah, unfortunately it was. Again, I'm sure Vinayak and I will differ there. I think Vinayak and both of us, Amit, I mean, I understand his points as well. And the good thing I think here is, you said hindsight is 2020. I hope for women's team hindsight will be 2024 because this is a solid group of players.
No, hindsight will be 2028 now, Mihir.
2028. Chalo, my reference point le raha tha Ranchi qualifiers, but I hope, this will be that one odd blip and the rest of the things will continue because Vinayak, whatever said and done, the core of the team is still very promising. I mean, of course, we can debate the quality of specialist players, the specialized roles players. The quality of that needs to improve. We need good track flickers, good poachers, like out and out strikers and all. Goalkeepers, I think we are sorted in that department. Bichu Devi is like a proper replacement for Savita whenever she decides to call it a day. So we have a core, and I'm assuming that, with Hockey India League also taking place next January, the options will only improve. And like it did with the men's team, you'd expect that the women would also benefit a whole lot with the league and make them a force eventually. But what do you think needs to happen between now and the World Cup being the next big assignment for them?
On this note, just to go back a little bit, you mentioned preparations, right? I mean, I actually think we also need to understand where this women's team is in the cycle. For example, the men's team have been, whatever their success that they're enjoying now is sort of the results of the Hockey India League and, the 2016 batch that did really well and being groomed to come here. The women's team is more recent, right? I mean, I remember Sid Pandey, one of the commentators for the tournament, who follows the Indian men's and women's teams very closely. He was mentioning not until very recently, the sort of backing that the women's team got from the administrators wasn't the same as the men's team. They're much more recent in the cycle. What Tokyo did was to make sure that they're almost always on a near sort of footing with the men's team, that they had the camps, they had the sort of support staff that needed. But even then, for the Asian Games, the men's team went to the mental conditioning coach, but the women's team didn't. Yannicke has been told us, the Indian Express in Delhi, that she's been asking for a mental conditioning coach for a long time. They got that only at the Asian Champions Trophy, where the men's team has been having it, Paddy Upton, for a while now, right? So there's always been that sort of a delay, lag between where the men's team are and the women's team are. So I think that sort of backing has also been a problem.
Sorry to interject, Vinayak. On this point also, it's important to mention, the whole difference in the way the teams are treated. I mean, the 2023 Hockey World Cup, initially when Hockey India put a bid, it was for the women's tournament. And then suddenly out of the blue, one day, they wake up, they decide to withdraw the Women's World Cup bid and instead have the men's one when they just hosted the one before that in 2018.
Right.
So you're right when you say that, it's often stepmotherly treatment. And also it's important to underline, like you mentioned, that it...
And not far back as well. We're not talking about like a decade back stepmotherly treatment. I mean, we're talking about very recently, right?
2019 was the first time in ages that all these players played in front of their home supporters. So, yeah. So I just wanted to say that you can carry on from where you were.
Exactly. And even when they played in Ranchi, that was the first standalone tournament that they've played, I think, since 2008 or 7. I forgot more than a decade. And the tournaments that they've played, matches they've played in home, whether one-off hockey qualifiers or a pro league match here or there, they've not actually had a standalone tournament at home. They have not played pro league since the first season where they were a last-minute addition. Yannicke spoke about not having enough, so they're looking for teams to stay match sharp. They play the Pro Nations Cup and then they go off and they don't play for a few months, and all they have to depend on is bilateral arrangements where the other teams are all part of the pro league, so it's not easy to get that quality of training or match practice. That's all been there. So when we speak about where things went wrong, and in a way I agree that it was on the wall, I still think that they sort of kept pushing above the collective sum of where they were, and it just like the one particular aspect that they've been trying to address but couldn't was the chance conversion. And what Amit was addressing was, if Rani was not part of the scheme, how else were they going to get those goals from, right? And we saw the Asian Games that they spread it out. That is one thing that Yannicke tried to do, that, we have enough attacking quality players, so let's spread the goals out, which worked at the Asian Games till they got to the semis. And the semis was just a case of not turning up, right? There is absolutely no excuse for what happened in that game against China. That was a big chance. I know China are under Alison Hanna and, Rick Charlesworth and all those big names are there. They're one of the teams on the rise, but India should have beaten China that day in Hangzhou. I think that was just because they didn't turn up and they didn't have the ability to handle the pressure that day. And the match against USA in Ranchi, the first match, they had to turn up. They just didn't. They've tried things that they normally don't do. So those are inexcusable for this team on the pitch. But I'm just trying to say that there are other things outside the pitch that we sometimes tend to forget just because, hey, this team almost finished with a medal in Tokyo. Why have they fallen? I think it's not that simplistic. I don't think they have fallen. There is one area that they tried to address and they didn't, and they paid the price for, 2 or 3 bad days on the pitch. I think overall the team has not fallen post Tokyo. I think that's the sort of narrative that I generally don't agree with.
That's a great point, and I think that's also a great way to end this thing that, all hope is not lost. In fact, this could be that springboard for them to kind of bounce back stronger. And before the LA Olympics, there's of course a whole lot more with the World Cup, Commonwealth Games if they happen, of course. But there will also be the Asian Games, and of course there'll be a ton of other matches in between. Women's hockey, of course, despite the results, they've been playing excellent hockey, good, interesting, fun hockey. So yeah, do keep watching and do keep listening to Game Time. Vinayk, thanks a lot for your time. Amit, thanks to you as well. And thanks for all our listeners for tuning in. We'll be back again next week. Thank you.
You were listening to Express Sports by the Indian Express. This week's show was edited and mixed by Suresh Pawar and produced by me, Shashank Bhargava. If you like the show, then do subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts. You can also recommend the show to someone you think will like it. Share it with a friend or someone in your family. It's the best way for people to get to know about us. You can also tweet us at Express Podcasts and write to us at podcasts@indianexpress.com.